Take three. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. Now, I was originally going to record an episode about different forms of taxation, but I think this one is a more interesting topic. I'm going to be looking at 11 reforms that, in my opinion, could save America. And I think a lot of people want, things to be less dystopian and less like a right wing authoritarian hellscape. So, okay, reform number one, end employment at will nationwide. So, what does that mean? What's the problem here? The problem is that employers can fire workers for any reason or none at a lot of different jobs. Now, some of you might not think that's a problem, but it really can be. So here's my reform: replace at will employment with just cause laws, requiring employers to show a valid reason for termination. Several states and countries already do this, and it would actually not be the most oppressive law of all time. And option number two, reform number two, I suppose I could say, a universal basic income or UBI pilot program. So the problem is that welfare is stigmatized and conditional, which makes people fall through the cracks. So my proposed reform, I was kind of merging those two words together there, but my proposed reform is to launch UBI pilots with long term federal funding to test unconditional monthly payments to all citizens, removing bureaucratic complexity, and reducing poverty traps. And I suppose you could work in a feature where, if a person's like I don't know, they're a billionaire, then maybe they don't get the UBI or something like that. I think that might be fair. Or you might allow people to opt out of it if they don't want to participate. But I think it would be a decent reform concept. And especially when increasingly jobs are going the way of the dodo bird, through automation and just irrelevancy. A common example that I cite is movie rental places. Now, people make fun of movie rental places these days. They look at it as, an outdated and goofy thing that people used to do. But just consider the fact that those were a lot of jobs that are no longer really there anymore. So it's an entire type of industry that's basically disappeared. And as time marches on, that could happen to more and more different jobs. And people need some sort of option in case they can't get steady, reliable employment after they lose such jobs. And what do you know? That's where the UBI would come in handy. And, the one example I gave might not seem that dramatic, but as things proceed, it's going to happen to more and more industries, pretty much guaranteed. So it's going to seem more and more plausible, at least in my opinion, as time goes on. So, proposal number three, reform number three, tax the rich for real. The problem that this would address is that corporate welfare and regressive tax structures fuel inequality. So, the reform is to implement a wealth tax, close loopholes, raise capital gains taxes, and enforce minimum corporate tax rates. Redirect funds away from subsidies for mega corporations. Okay, reform number four, slash the defense budget dramatically. The problem is that military spending gets a pass while social programs get scrutinized. It's one of the things I've noted over and over again. So the reform is to cut Pentagon spending by at least 50% and overseas bases where unnecessary. And in my opinion, they are probably unnecessary practically in every instance. Now, I know people disagree with that, but that's my opinion anyway. And, that money could be redirected, those funds could be redirected to domestic infrastructure, education, and healthcare. And guess what? Maybe some actual defense training, like in terms of, you know, instead of invading other countries, teach people how to defend themselves and, not for some BS right wing reasons to conquer other countries, but, you know, teach them actual ethics that are about actual self defense, not just some madman at the top wanting to attack some foreign country and take over their resources, but, actual ethics that involve the principle of self defense on a large scale. How about, educational principles actually being implemented so people actually recognize what self defense means? And of course, you could still have some sort of defense budget because, Vladimir Putin or people like him, they are out there and they could invade. But what have we learned in so many instances? Quite often, when it is an invader, it is the United States or, an ally, or, the law and order people are actually on the side of the invaders half the time. So, reform number 5, moving on, enact transparent government oversight bodies. So, what problem does this address? The lack of accountability that fuels corruption and double standards. So, the reform that I propose: create independent watchdog agencies with subpoena power, not answerable to political appointees, to monitor lobbying, campaign finance, and military contracting. Now, to my mind, there's nothing radical about that. That's like a very down to earth proposal, and it would be interesting to have that implemented and made strong, so it would get rid of the corruption. And option number 6, maybe this should be number 1 as a reform, but campaign finance reform. The problem is straightforward here: oligarchs and corporations buy influence. So, my reform: overturn Citizens United, cap individual donations, publicly fund campaigns. That's if you don't keep things, relatively the way they are now. If you actually have backbone and you say, let's get rid of all these bribes that fund our political campaigns and therefore our politicians and therefore our policies, and outlaw dark money super PACs, restore a level playing field in elections. So, how about that? That's another possible proposal here. So, 7, the option here is to strengthen whistleblower protections. The problem is that people are trying to expose government or corporate abuse and they can get crushed. So, the reform is to expand protections, reward public interest whistleblowing, and criminalize retaliatory firings or lawsuits. Okay, you could also get rid of NDAs too, non disclosure agreements, which are often, a pretty rotten thing. Maybe there are some instances where you could justify them. I don't know. But it seems like whenever I hear about an NDA, it ends up sort of just benefiting bad intent. So, reform number 8 is end corporate personhood. The problem is that corporations enjoy the rights of people with none of the same responsibilities. So, my reform: amend the Constitution or reinterpret legal precedent to deny corporations First Amendment speech rights, so called speech rights, used to justify political spending. So, yeah, that's another one that maybe I could have put in the number one spot. But again, these aren't necessarily in order of importance, they're just scrambled together. Okay, proposal number 9, institute a fair and transparent welfare system, because welfare is going to be more and more important as those jobs get slashed. So this is, possibly if we don't have the UBI or whatever. So the problem is that welfare is overly complex, punitive, and stigmatized. So the reform: simplify access, reduce paperwork, remove asset limits, and eliminate the work requirement myth. Treat welfare as a right, not a handout. And so we're on to option number 10. That reform is to establish a People's Policy Board. Now this is one of the more interesting ones, I think. Maybe some places do this. I'm not really aware like how often this is done. But the problem it's addressing is that public input gets filtered through party elites and lobbyists. So, a possible reform is to create a randomly selected, rotating group of citizens, a sortition, who review and comment on major federal legislation before passage, like a jury duty for democracy. Now, I know this would not be the most popular idea of all time, and it would be kind of rough to implement, perhaps, but it would be it would be an interesting concept. I think it might have value, and I'm sure there would be people out there who would say it doesn't have value as an idea, but yeah, whatever. I'm open to hearing those views, but I think it's actually a you know an idea that withstands scrutiny. We know the kind of doofuses that we get in government as it is. I think if you have just people randomly selected to look at policy and make comments on it, to give an idea of how it could impact regular people, I think that could have an impact that could be positive, at least in many instances. So my reform number 11, this seems to be quite relevant right now, but general amnesty for nonviolent immigrants. So the problem, well, I mean, there's a lot of problems right now going on when it comes to this issue and how it's being addressed in a fascistic manner. But the U.S. immigration system is riddled with cruelty, hypocrisy, selective outrage, and actual crimes, being committed, even as I speak, in the name of law and order. So, my reform is to enact a general amnesty for all undocumented immigrants not convicted of violent crimes. If you show up and you can't be demonstrated to have a violent criminal history, then of course you should be able to have a chance to get in. It's as simple as that. The proposal would grant legal status, protection from deportation, and a path to citizenship for millions who've lived, worked, and contributed in the U.S., often for decades. And let's be real, if law and order is the excuse for hardline immigration policy, why is Donald Trump, who himself has been entangled in criminal investigations and civil fraud cases aplenty, why is he given a pass? Why is he pardoning January 6th rioters, some of whom violently attacked police officers and tried to overturn an election, and who had violent criminal histories before and after January 6th? A lot of those January 6th people, they were criminals before and after that infamous day. So the hypocrisy runs even deeper, of course. I'm going to go even further here. The US has stomped around the globe for decades, invading countries, toppling governments, funding coups, arming dictators and terrorist groups, and, you know, propping up all kinds of atrocities when it suits our so called national interest. That's from Iraq to Honduras to Libya and on and on. We've destabilized entire regions and then turn around and acted shocked when people flee the chaos we helped create in a lot of instances. And we violate other countries' borders all the time, then act shocked about some people who do so who are just traveling around looking for work in a lot of cases. And even of course when it is a criminal, like their crimes typically are far from being as bad as some of the stuff that the US government has done to other foreign populations. So I mean, the hypocrisy is off the charts. And now we're the ones clutching our pearls about border integrity when you know the the president is talking about invading Canada and Greenland and Mexico and all that kind of stuff. We're gonna act like somebody showing up here to work at a lumber yard, or as a picking crops, or working as a janitor, or something like that. Working a construction job or fast food or something. Like if they get a job doing something like that, we're gonna act like that's the highest crime imaginable when we're supporting all these dictatorships and literal terrorist organizations and genocide campaigns and stuff. Like somebody flipping a burger, uh, working in a restaurant or something. uh, that seems like less of a serious crime than arming and funding some genocide somewhere. So when the United States does all this stuff violently across the globe, why should anyone respect borders drawn by countries that violate them at will? So, yes, Donald Trump has also described the US Canada border as an artificially drawn line. So, he himself actually debunked the basic premise of a border. He said that repeatedly in public spaces. He's even suggested that it should be erased. So during a meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, he said somebody drew that line many years ago, like with a ruler, just a straight line right across the top of the country, mocking the very idea of a U.S. Canada border. And he's actually not just suggested that Canada could become the 51st U.S. state, but he's threatened to invade Canada and make it become the 51st state. So, if at this point we're like urging everybody else to take borders seriously, yet we're acting like that on the national level, um, how do you not see that as a hypocrisy that's basically the most glaring hypocrisy imaginable? I mean, it just mocks the idea of borders more than I have ever done, and I'm not even a firm believer in borders. But this is somebody who's saying that he's like the biggest proponent of law and order, and saying that borders are the most important thing, and all that kind of stuff. When he's you know threatening Canada because their border is, again, what he called an artificially drawn line. Well, that's kind of what a border is, you dipshit. That's what they are. They are artificially drawn lines. You're the one who is trying to get, you know, people whipped up about that artificially drawn line. So it's just insane, the insanity here. I could go on and on about it, but let's not forget the horrors happening inside our own borders right now, and not just in LA, although that's getting the headlines at the moment, but that too is in the name of law and order. All of this chaos that's happening is because people are going, these, well, there are various people now. It's various types of authorities are going into these different areas, and sometimes they are literal Nazis who have infiltrated these, these authority positions, and they're just causing chaos. They're vilifying people who just look different in a lot of cases. A lot of these people, they do not have, a lot of the people that they're arresting and antagonizing, they don't have criminal records, especially not violent criminal records. So this isn't happening in some dystopian sci-fi novel. It's happening here, now, and under the banner of immigration enforcement. So if we're serious about justice, fairness, or even basic decency, a general amnesty isn't radical, it's just overdue. So close the book on the war against the undocumented and redirect enforcement to actual threats, proven threats, not people looking for a better life in the ruins that we helped create.